This is the GBA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series, brought to you by the GBA podcast. Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DE&I, is a term often used in the workplace, but its meaning is sometimes not well understood. Within each episode of this series, we hope to shed light and awareness on the DE&I landscape in our industry. We'll discuss the pipeline to diversity and inclusion in the geoprofessions, identify key allies in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and discuss how unconscious bias can contribute to inequity in STEM education and career development. GBA is committed to increasing diversity and promoting inclusion and equity in the geoprofessional industry. We hope you can share these episodes within your organization. Please join us as we explore these topics in a 4-part series on DE&I. Today we'll be speaking to Charlie Head, founding principal at Sanborn Head and Associates. Charlie is the co-founder of Sanborn Head, and he serves as the chair of the company's board of directors and oversees the implementation of the firm's strategic market. Charlie steers initiatives related to the expansion of the firm's services and markets, and he remains active in Sanborn Head's professional practice with particular emphasis on environmental assessments and remediation, including due diligence for clients globally. He's also a past president of GBA. Charlie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Veronica. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining. We know that you have been involved with Sanborn Head's initial D&I initiatives, so we're really happy to hear that some of our member firms are taking some actions towards improving the diversity, equity, and inclusion in our industry. So, Charlie, as a leader in our industry, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you, and why are they important for you?
Well, that's a really big question. So maybe we could break it down a little bit. But just, I think, by way of introduction, first of all, as a matter of fairness, DEI is simply the right thing to do. But if we look through the lens of our business, we are now and have been, frankly, for most of my career in a war for talent. And if we don't do something to change the trajectory and bring more people into the fold. And I'm really talking about all people, including people in underrepresented groups. We're going to have a difficult time growing and sustaining our businesses. This is something that is relatively new here at Sanborn Head. We just started looking at DEI in a formal way about a year ago. And so in my talk today, really, I'm still on a path as a learner, certainly not an expert, but I'm glad to share with you what I've learned.
Absolutely, Charlie. And I just want to say none of us are fully experts. We are all learning. I'm not an expert, I'm a geotechnical engineer. But I am really passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion and your point of sustainability. And like you said, a war for talent is one of my main motivators also to making sure that we have the best talent that is going to move forward our industry and we're not missing out on talent. I'm sure that you've had issues before in the past, probably trying to find good candidates. I also have kind of issues in the past trying to find good candidates. And if we kind of increase the talent pool, that's only going to elevate competition, elevate our industry. Is that something that you've kind of are in line with what you're thinking right now?
Yeah, well, it certainly is. And, I think we will probably talk about it in a little more depth later in our discussion. But clearly, if we look just at the gender issue alone, it's been my experience for the entirety of my career that although we start with staff at approximately equal male female mix, by the time we get to management or particularly C suite levels, that ratio is very different. And that really hasn't changed over time. So just looking there, that's a major issue. But certainly we can extend that to uh, apply to people of color, people who are non-gender conforming, LGBTQ community, the whole spectrum of underrepresented groups.
Absolutely. Oh, that is so important. So, just as a follow-up question, what has been your experience with new diversity, equity, and inclusions initiatives at Sanborn Hats? What are you guys doing to address the issue internally? And I understand you guys are just starting, so Anything that you guys can add to for our listeners.
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about our journey and how we started it because I'm really excited about it, and like you, Veronica, I'm also become really passionate about it. About a year ago, a little bit less, we formed after careful consideration by the board of directors and looking to some of our peer firms and what they were doing for DEI, we formed a task force. And the task force is really comprised of myself and our HR director, but we're not the leaders of the task force. We are members of the task force. We asked for volunteers, and at the end of the day, we ended up with 11 men and women, about equal numbers of both. We have people of color, we have non-gender conforming people on the committee, and we formed a task force. We hired an outside firm to help lead us and facilitate this process. And we launched the task force with the objective of first engaging in some real deep learning. And once we had taken on that after 4 or 5 months, we began to turn and look at what are the kinds of things that we might begin to do as a firm with the objective that at the end of this year, we will be providing to the board of directors a plan, sunsetting the task force, probably turning this task force into a full-time committee, moving forward to implement DEI policies and other, again, continued learning experiences for the firm going forward.
Well, that sounds great, and it really sounds very much in line with a lot of our initiatives in our own D&I committee within GBA, which, just as you, started as a task force last year. And during the task force, it was, like you said, a very introspective period where we learned the pipeline of our industry. And we talked in length about that in our podcast and also within our own committee. So it sounds like you're heading in a direction very similar to a lot of our peers.
I think that our feeling is that if we try to mandate something from the top, if we try to drive training for DEI, that's just not going to work. It has to be really something that people embrace, that they become passionate about, that they can really begin to understand at more of a grassroots level why this is so important and what are the things that they can begin, that we all can begin to do about it. In our group, we've had people who have been with the firm as long as I have, almost 30 years, and we've had people who have been with the firm for 6 months. We've had senior people, we've had more junior people, so a variety of experience for the firm. And boy, that's brought some really interesting perspective and challenges to the discussion. And one of the most wonderful things is the openness with which we've been able to have these discussions and the growth, the trust that's grown between the team and how much that's done already to create awarenesses that frankly I don't think any of us really had when we started this journey.
Well, it really sounds like you guys are creating a safe space for your employees to now start to speak up with any sort of concerns they might have had.
Veronica, this is the start of it. And this is something that I hope that we can begin to extend on a more firm-wide basis. As I said, we're really just at the beginning of the journey, and really the how is that's challenging. And I'm not sure I can tell you the how, maybe give you a few thoughts and ideas, but again, we're still formulating that here at our firm. We did launch just recently a DEI survey to see if we could sort of tease out some of the thoughts and attitudes and perspectives of a broader range of our employees. I was super pleased to see that we had an 85% response rate to that survey. And I was also super pleased to see that the majority of people who work here believe that DEI is either important or very important. And that gives us a lot to work with, I think, going forward.
Well, I gotta say, I'm very impressed about that. One thing that I was gonna say before you mentioned about the surveys, my podcast episode before this, which at the time of this recording hasn't aired yet, was with a senior diversity and inclusion member of FDA, so the Food and Drug Administration, and she pretty much just handles a giant agency of federal employees within diversity, equity, and inclusion. And her job is to do surveys every year in and out. And I learned a lot about her perspective as well. So it's like you said, it doesn't necessarily start from the top down, but you have to understand your audience to say. You have to understand what your employees are looking for so you can help them better and address their needs. So it sounds like you guys are really doing something great.
Well, I think this is a good start. It certainly gives us a nice baseline with which to measure some progress over the future. But it seemed to me that we were at least beginning in a good place.
Absolutely. It does seem to me as well. So I commend you for that. So really what we're here to talk about is allyship and how can senior leaders become allies of other underrepresented groups. And as you know, unfortunately, our industry, the geoprofessional industry, is one of the least diverse industries in STEM. There's been several articles about that, and the data that we gathered, especially from the U.S. Census Bureau, suggests so. So, to invoke change in our industry, leaders like yourself, we need allies and to help support and advocate for underrepresented groups. So, for you personally or professionally, what does it mean to be an ally for diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, it's another big question. It's something that I've thought about quite a bit. My experience, I should say, isn't just with DEI, isn't just related to my work at Sanborn Head. About the same time, maybe a little bit earlier than we started a DEI initiative here, I became very involved in a racial justice initiative in an outside group. So I've really had a chance to look at this through a couple different lenses. And I think something about being an ally was something maybe up to about a year ago I had never really given consideration to formally. That is, my awareness just wasn't there. But clearly, if we look at what is an ally, basically, an ally is really someone who is not a member of an underrepresented group, but who holds a position of privilege and power and can advocate and take action to support that less representative group without taking over their voice. And so if we start there, I think from a company perspective, the answer might be a little more difficult to answer. So let me look at it from a personal perspective. And I think this is something that is really a kind of a cultural shift we need to think about in our firm. And I think that shift needs to occur first and foremost with those who are in a position of privilege and power. And so I think there are several things that are important and things that we could do personally. Um, I think being aware, first of all, of bias and embracing a growth mindset is really important. I think we need to be open to change. I think we need to be open to looking at ourselves a little bit more critically. Hopefully, we can continue to have somewhat of a sense of humor about ourselves. But let me give you a few examples. Um, I grew up in a strongly sexist culture. I just did. Those sexist messages were coming at me through TV and through advertisements and through things I heard in school. It was just part of the culture of my growing up. Wasn't mean spirited. It was just part of the deal. Um, and I think being bombarded with that and not adopting some kind of bias would be really difficult. It would be like, and I'm going to steal something from Ibram Kendi, it'd be like standing in the rain and not getting wet. So I think as we look at our biases, I think we need to be somewhat introspective about that, and try to understand these biases from an objective point of view. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And I think the work that we've done through our DEI committee and or task force, and the work that I was doing in the Racial Justice Committee has enabled me to at least get a handle on what that might sort of look like. So I think that's number one, is try to be aware of the biases that we naturally carry and to adopt a growth mindset. At the very same time, I think we need to keep our tendency to defend in check. Um, this can be a little threatening, honestly, if if you don't adopt a growth mindset. because you can be challenged on things that maybe you just haven't really thought about much in the past. And that can drive perhaps even a sense of shame or defensiveness. And that, of course, creates completely the wrong direction of movement that we want to create. We want to create a direction of movement toward these issues. So I think being aware of that tendency to defend, that can be really important too. Something that I've learned that seems kind of obvious, but something that really has been brought to my attention is speak up if you see people abusing their power with others. And clearly that can go to racist or sexist jokes, for example, but it can go to simply small things like microaggressions too. And I think if we can be interrupters of those kinds of behaviors, I think that's something we can do to be an ally as well. And there are several other things we could go on, but maybe I'll stop there if you want to explore any of these in any more depth or whether we want to just kind of continue.
Well, that was spot on, and I would have given you an applause if I could. But yeah, there was a lot of things that you said. First of all, your definition for an ally, I think, is spot on. It's definitely somebody who can recognize your position as a leader, and you said a very critical word, privilege, which it's almost a taboo word and almost a word that sometimes I try to stay away from because it creates divisiveness. But as you mentioned, it is difficult to accept sometimes your position, that you have position of privilege. But something that we've mentioned, we discuss in our committee sometimes, or even with me with other colleagues, it's okay to have some privilege. You don't have to be ashamed to be privileged. I kind of try to see it as I'm Puerto Rican, and because I'm Puerto Rican, I'm an American citizen. So I have the privilege to be an American citizen as opposed to some other of my Latin Americans brothers and sisters. So to me, that's a privilege, and it's something not for me to be ashamed that I'm able to come to this country, right? So the same thing with you. You've grown this firm, and you have that privilege, and that's okay. But it's difficult for people to kind of accept that there's a privilege and not feel maybe guilty about it. So there's a lot of thought behind of the words that you said, and for somebody to actually get to that position. So yeah, I agree with 100% with everything that you said. Accepting bias is very difficult. You said that you grew up in a sexist culture, and I think a lot of people did. It's just part and inherently part of our culture even today. So just kind of accepting those things and catching yourself is really important. Have you felt, kind of a follow-up question, as you kind of got into more maybe racial justice work, or even with more diversity, equity, inclusion work, have you caught yourself maybe with a thought or a passing thought, or maybe an idea or a word or a phrase that you're like, this is not 100% right. Let me check myself.
So let me give you kind of a fun example that occurred to me a few weeks ago, actually, when I was driving with my wife. And this is one that I'm going to use this word, but I'm not going to use it quite in the same way that it might normally be meant. I was ashamed of. And so I'm embracing that because it's part of this growth mindset. And this is an example, but when I was growing up, I remember driving with my grandfather, who I respected dearly. And we would be driving down the road and would see somebody driving erratically. He would say, women drivers. And I'll tell you, I'd heard that and that was sort of ingrained in me. And to this day, I still have that reaction. And I had that reaction when I was driving with my wife. We were looking at somebody driving poorly, and I thought this to myself. I said, I'm just going to name this. So I said it out loud. I said, this, I can't believe what I'm thinking. I know there's nothing inherently, different between men and women that cause one to be a good driver or a bad driver. I know that. I've known that for my entire adult life. But look at this reaction that I have from something that was sort of ingrained in me when I was a child. That at that time nobody meant any offense by it, but that's the kind of thing that you check yourself by. And once I became aware of these types of biases, sure, they come up. Uh, I guess maybe not frequently, but enough that it catches my attention. And if we adopt that kind of learning mindset, and we can sort of see this type of behavior, these types of thoughts, in that framework, and we can name it. I think that that goes a long way to beginning us down that path to be able to make the kinds of corrections that we need to engender more inclusivity in the in our work or in our home or in our communities.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds simple, but that transfers so well even into our industry. I mean, one of the starting lines in our article was that society has taught us that engineers and scientists are a male job. Nobody intended anything bad by it, maybe, but it did affected our industry, and to an extent affects our society because we have less talent. So even a simple thing like that, it does transfer into our industry in a very powerful way.
I think it does, Veronica, and I think that this is something we need to think very hard about how we're going to change that narrative. How do we do that? Early on, and I think there are a lot of things people are doing, reaching into school, secondary schools, for example. But that's the kind of narrative that we really need to change deeply if we're going to change our industry.
Well, actually, that's a good segue for my next question is kind of how do we change the industry? So we know that our industry is not diverse, but unfortunately, this leaky pipeline, as I like to call it, is something that's prevalent within, corporate America, that we don't see enough women as leaders. So, as the McKinsey and Company has reported, entry level women, and also as you said in the beginning of our podcast, are pretty equal when they enter. But then when they start getting to the senior positions, it drops off significantly. And women of color tend to be the lowest on that rank, only 3%. And also, whereas other studies also show that women leave engineering at a much faster pace than men, one study showed that women leave 1 in 4 compared to 1 in 10 of men by age 7 or 8 of their careers, which is probably around the time where there's, if you start your career when you're early 20s, that's probably around the time where you start having children or settling down. Some people think that that might be because of, you know, women wanted to be in the household, but that did not end up to be the case based on more research that we found. But that really goes into my question. I can deviate easily from that. But really my question is what can you or maybe other allies can help to recruit and retain these women and underrepresented groups and better this pipeline so we have a better talent pool?
Again, another really big question, and one with no easy answers. If we look on the recruiting end of this, clearly our firm has always recruited openly. We have never been biased in the types of people whom we recruit. We welcome qualified candidates from all groups. But at the same time, you're right about this. In general, most of the candidate pool tends to be white in our area anyway. Um, and then you're right as we move people along in their careers. We, like most of the industry, tend to lose more women than men. So it is a leaky pipeline. On the recruiting end, I think from what we've been thinking about and what we've been learning about, it isn't just as simple as saying, well, let's just recruit more people of color, for example, or recruit women differently, because that just won't work. I think you really need to start first by examining your firm to see whether you truly have an inclusive environment and where there's equity in the firm. Because if there isn't, you could recruit all you want, and I don't think people will stay. So I think the issue around recruiting, certainly we've thought about recruiting strategies that could broaden the places we recruit from, and I'm certainly we will do that, um, and that could be very important. But I think for the first step is to make sure that the firm we have is inclusive firm. Um, let's before we talk about retention, maybe just stop there, and should we think about that a little bit more, or should we move on to the issue of retention?
No, I think there's a lot to say. I mean, something that you mentioned that I actually haven't discussed too much about. It sounds like you guys are trying to create an environment where people are attracted to. So this is if I am a candidate, I'm looking at different firms. Sanborn Head sounds like a company that might be very inclusive and therefore more attractive as far as recruitment. Well, and then there's a second part of what you mentioned was let's just ask for more women of color. Well, it gets tricky, right? And I'm sure you've experienced this too with HR. You can't necessarily tell your recruiter, "Hey, I only want people of color. I only want women." It doesn't really help that way. It doesn't work that way for the most part. But you can scrutinize more your recruiters and make sure that your pool candidate, and that might take more work, but that your candidate pool of people or a better representative. That's what it sounds like where you're going through.
I think that's the key is making sure that your candidate pool is fully represented. You're getting the broadest candidate pool you can possibly get. And that I think that is key. And so I think really examining recruiting practices, that's a good step in that process. But again, it falls back to making sure, do you have an environment where women and people of color or underrepresented groups where they're going to thrive? And if you don't, better start there because that's really much more fundamental. And I think at Sanborn Head, I think we do have a culture that's inclusive, where we do have equity. But I think, to be perfectly honest, there's more we could do along those lines. We started as a firm by four white guys. It was a white male monoculture. We're way more diverse than that now. But if we were really honest with ourselves, and we've been looking at this very carefully in our DEI group, we still retain a lot of the elements of that white male monoculture that started almost 30 years ago. Again, a lot of improvement, a lot of change at the time, but there are things that we're looking to do strategically to change the trajectory so we can become an even more inclusive uh, workplace.
Well, as far as that answering the question of recruitment, I do want to mention that a lot of times when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, it feels very doom and gloom. I think it's important to also kind of celebrate the wins, even if they're small wins. So you guys started with just four white males, but now you have a female in your board of directors, and your office is a lot more representative. That's a win, and I think it's important to also recognize those things.
Yeah, I think so too, Veronica, and I'm really proud about where we are and where we've come to. And all I'm saying is I think we've got more work to do, and that's great.
Yeah, we all got more work to do.
There's always some areas to improve. So I think that the fun thing is to see some of the passion that we're beginning to generate around the kinds of things that we could be doing, as I said, to change the trajectory of that a little bit, and move from that sort of uh, using the terms in a paper that we've used as a basis for some of our planning, from exclusive club to truly inclusive organization. We're on the path, and we have ways to get to where we want to be.
So you've created a firm that people of color, maybe people that look like me, feel a little bit more comfortable going to work in. So now, how do you retain that underrepresented group that we're seeing in the pipeline that are leaving in greater numbers than others?
That's a really,
It's a tough
really
question.
tough question. Um, it's one that I and other senior people in the firm have wrestled with it for a long time. Um, I read an interesting article uh, about 2 or 3 months ago, published in Harvard Business Review, and it looked at this very issue. And it looked at it a little bit differently than I think I'd ever been thinking about it before. Um, it was somewhat eye-opening, and it uh, particularly looked at professional service firms, so firms like ours. Um, they said there's a narrative in these firms that goes something like this: high level jobs require extremely long hours. Women's devotion to family makes it impossible for them to put in those long hours, and their careers suffer as a result. The linchpin to that narrative is a belief in women's natural fitness for family and men's for work. Both suffer. And what the article argues was the really long hours culture built into uh, the the work that many of our firms do is detrimental to both men and women, and just in different ways. And what they argued, whether one believes it or not, that unless you cure this long hours culture, you're really not going to get at some of the roots of the retention issues that we're seeing. And again, the article talked about this in terms of both men and women. It tends to affect men and women differently. So I thought that was very interesting. And to be honest with you, I haven't really taken that much further than just thinking a lot about it because if it's right, that's a pretty big problem to tackle. So it isn't just simply if it's right, it's just simply not making policies where, perhaps you're allowing people to go part time or certain family leave policies. Those are all important. Don't get me wrong. I believe in them, but this says it's something more fundamental at stake here that is more fundamentally needs to change if we're going to really cure the leaky pipeline situation.
Well, you said a couple of things that are really important. Number one, there are many surveys, especially from the Society of Women Engineers, that surveyed hundreds of women on why they left engineering. The long work hours are definitely up there, and like you said, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's only a female thing. It can definitely affect men too. I mean, my husband is also an engineer. I can see that we're both in the same boat. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that a woman might not want to work long hours, might not want to travel. And a lot of times, you know, some leaders, some managers might think, oh, well, Sally has a kid. I'm not going to send her to this out of state trip because she's going to say no. I think it's important to also consider, what the women actually want to do or what the underrepresented group actually wants to do. And to that, I think you are doing it correctly because you're not thinking what I'm going to do. You're thinking what do they need in order to stay.
Right. And I think there are a lot of assumptions that are just made about men and women that aren't necessarily always correct, certainly on an individual by individual basis. And again, if we get back to the biases that we started talking about at the beginning of the conversation, some of those beliefs are simply rooted in our longstanding biases, and they simply play into our behaviors at work. And so we really need to examine that and think about this. These are the kinds of things that are pretty fundamental to change if we really want to make these changes.
I've kind of been involved with, in situations where I kind of throw myself in the hat and I've been told pretty much, I don't think that's a good idea because you shouldn't be traveling that much. Meanwhile, in my own household, with my father, my husband, my family that lives nearby, and they're all like, "We'll support you, and you can do whatever you want. You can travel, you can work in Orlando." And unfortunately, because of that, I ended up leaving that company. Not only because of that, but that was definitely kind of almost a nail in the coffin.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it was a company that I did like working with, and but I did needed that trust. And also for my managers to trust in what I was looking for as I was becoming a manager myself. So that communication wasn't quite there, and I think that there was a big like you said, a big judgment call made just because I had a young child at home. So it was difficult. But if we take that objectively and we just look at that situation, that company, had me as a manager leaving and now they have that position to fill. So the question that I keep asking to myself is not only, it's not only like how the people maybe like me that are represented underrepresented are being affected by diversity, equity, inclusion, but how much is a company. So even if you don't care about this, you have to care that you want to retain your employees. and you want to retain the best employees. And you don't want to spend time training an employee just to have them leave, right? So that's why retention to me is so important. And I think to me is so tied into diversity, equity, inclusion, and to having allies as well. Because if I will have an ally, then maybe that ally would have said, no, she says that she's fine with traveling, she can travel.
I think you've just given a great example to what an ally would do, and I think that's the kinds of things that we can do: step in, disrupt, and advocate. I think it's really critical, and everybody is different, and everybody's tolerance for long hours is different. But we have certain attitudes which are really ingrained in our narrative, that our traditional narrative, that uh, tend to underlie a lot of this, I believe. And so I think examining that, starting there, is really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I've worked with so many people and I have, you know, men, other male colleagues that tell me, nope, I have to be home at 5 o'clock because I have to go take care of the kids. And my boss, she's a female, she is at work at 6:30 in the morning and leaves at 5 o'clock. So everybody's a little bit different. And I think it's important to give everybody the flexibility to do their job, and trust them that they can do their job properly.
Well, you've also mentioned, this is also another interesting thing, a little bit tangential, but maybe not so much. And that's the world that we now have, hopefully are starting to emerge from once we get COVID under control, and that is a world where there's a whole lot more flexibility in terms of how we work, where we work, and when we work. And for me personally, as an older white guy, I think it's terrific. I love the flexibility, but I can imagine that people who are all different ages and different, whether you're caring for elderly parents, whether you're caring for children, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, suddenly you've got even more flexibility to be able to do that and to also continue working and interacting and moving along in your career. And perhaps in that respect, the flexibility our newfound flexibility, which I don't think we're going to be retreating from, is going to be a good thing for retention. I certainly see the potential for that to be the case.
No, I think so too. And the funny thing is, talking about kind of, what people might think about male versus women. I personally like coming to the office. I like interacting with people. I like seeing my supervisees, talking to them, mentoring them. My husband, he likes working from home. A lot of his colleagues are in different states, and he just feels like he gets more done working from home. So it's almost opposite as maybe a lot of people might think. So that's why it's important just to understand your workforce and your employees. So even in this question, I think we're touching in a lot of items that we mentioned before.
Yeah, I agree.
So it is difficult, like we mentioned before, and you mentioned it's difficult to introspect and kind of catch yourself and not be ashamed of maybe having past biases. And as we talked about before, we've seen a lot of surveys where and these are year-long surveys. It was conducted over 2 years in the US and in the UK that show that a large number of managers feel uncomfortable participating in common job-related activities with women, like mentoring, going to dinner, going or a business dinner, going to a travel, for work, that sort of thing. So, which is really disheartening, and it seems like it has not gotten any better, and that just limits opportunities for women to be exposed, or not only that, but to receive more mentorship. So, what do you think is the most effective way to engage and have more male allies?
When I thought about this statistic, and I've seen this published in a number of places, particularly relating to the number of women who left the workforce, just during COVID, and issues around, um, the office maybe becoming more male than it's been in years, and how the things are sort of going in the wrong direction, and the challenges there. That's again another tough one. I think I would hope that men could be persuaded by the, the business argument that increasing the diversity of their workforce just brings more people into the tent, so to speak, allows um, their businesses to grow and to thrive, and that there's a really strong business argument to be made to sort of get over that issue of being uncomfortable with women or underrepresented groups, and embrace the idea of allyship and mentorship to help people move along. I'm not really sure what's driving this. There may be some concerns over the Me Too movement, for example. I really don't know. But if that's the case, and there are people who are, uncomfortable knowing, where the bounds of harassment are, there's harassment training, and our firm does, as many firms do. We provide harassment training, which is really important, I think. Hopefully, it's not that, but if it is, that's someplace you could turn. But I think as we continue to evolve this whole DEI, our thinking in DEI and our understanding of DEI, hopefully we can engage more men in the idea of allyship, again, both for women and for other underrepresented groups, and and maybe talk through some of these things and kind of think through some of these things together to try to figure out how we can solve that problem. But again, it's a tough one. It's tough to change people's attitudes and ways of thinking, and tough to change concerns they may have. So, but clearly something that's very important to work on.
Yeah, I think you've hit it right in the head. I simply say that this is just good for business and it makes sense. So, like you said in the beginning of the conversation, it's not only the right thing to do, but it just makes sense. It makes business sense too. You keep more pool, you keep more people. There's more competition among your employees or your candidates, whether that's a just positive competition. But it also just keeps more people and just increase your talent pool. It can elevate our industry. So I think that argument alone can help at least people bring them into accepting diversity, equity, inclusion, and hopefully the goal would be to have some of those people that accept that this is an issue and it's an issue that is going to help our industry if we do address it. But then I guess the next step is to also having more mentors and more allies. So I guess to follow up that question, if there is maybe a senior leader that that hasn't yet um, started maybe a mentoring program or haven't yet mentored somebody or doesn't really seem as an ally, what advice could you give to that person and say like, hey, um, let me talk to you about this and see how we can actually have you be a mentor as well.
Yeah, to me it's probably not quite as obvious because it's harder to see it from my perspective. From again, people, the men that I know in this company certainly would, from my perspective, I think, would be very open, and in fact do mentor women and people of color. Um, and perhaps it's something simply that I can't see as easily given my position. And so I think in the first instance, we would need to understand, I would need to understand it more, and I'm not quite sure how I'd go about that, but it seems like the kind of thing that, perhaps we would want to dig into more to see whether is this a problem here at our firm? And then if it is, that'd be the process of discovery. And then I think we could begin to think about how we could begin to address it. More globally, as we were talking here, I'm wondering whether GBA could have some programming on this. It seems like a great idea for some kind of program at one of GBA's conferences, because I think and I believe that most white men want to do the right thing and want to want want to be an ally in the right way, and maybe they just don't quite know how. I'm only gauging that based on the statistic that was cited, not based on my personal observation. But if they don't know how, then perhaps something GBA could begin to tackle.
Yeah, I think you're giving us some ideas for our own committee. There are a couple of things that we're doing in our own committee. We're putting together a best practices document that at the time of this recording hasn't. We're still in the works. Hopefully, we'll have something out by the fall. But some of the topics that we're including in our best practices is having some sort of mentorship program. GBA did publish a best practices to start your own mentorship program. I think it was quite a bit. I think it was like 10 years ago, so it's been some time. But that's just a little tidbit there for GBA. But I mean, absolutely, I think just providing that resource to our member firms and give them some encouragement of how to go about this. I mean, it's difficult, and I think in your answer you kind of alluded the same thing. You have to be introspective, see what your workforce actually look like you said, maybe in your position you're not seeing everybody day to day, but that's why it's important to understand surveys and data and see what your employees actually need. Maybe you do have enough mentors. Maybe you need more in certain areas. Maybe there's a particular office that doesn't have enough mentors. So it really ties back um, to understanding your workforce, which we discussed in length in my second episode. So it's interesting how all these things are tied together.
They are. And by the way, again, you mentioned the survey, and this is one of many reasons we ran the survey is to try to sort of tease out, at least initially, some of these questions. And I wish I could report back to you what that survey said. I just very, very high level. We just got the results back, and we'll be looking at it in more depth with our DEI community, task force in a week. Um, but this is the kind of thing we were trying to tease out with the survey, and we'll see how successful we are.
Well, one thing to mention that I wanted to say later, you said that you have 85% response and that you actually had a big number of people in your workforce that said that they do think that this is important. I think a lot of people are scared of surveys because they think that it's going to air out the dirty laundry. But I think some people, and also with my conversations with Christina in my second episode, some people will do a survey and they're pleasantly surprised. They have good news. People want to get more involved with DNI. People have ideas. So, it can get a little doom and gloom, and I'm definitely there. I see that percentage of 3% women of color in C-suites, and I feel it, and I want to break that statistic. But I think it's also important to kind of celebrate the small wins. So you had a great survey. Hopefully that empowers other companies and other people to start, surveying their employees and hearing from them and not feel like they're going to shy away from them because they're afraid of the results.
I hope so too, Veronica. And I don't see doom and gloom. By the way, I'm really excited about this, and not just from the perspective of myself or our firm, but for our industry. I certainly talk to a lot of my peers throughout the industry, and frankly, there are a lot of really fine firms that are ahead of us, and others who are certainly jumping on and are very excited about the kinds of things that they can do and are doing. And I think the future in that regard holds a lot of great possibilities for all of us. So I think this is an issue that over the past several years we've become more aware of. I think people are embracing it more. We're all on that path and certainly making mistakes as we go. But as we discussed, if we can be open to our mistakes and learn from them, boy, I think there's just a lot we can do here and a lot of breakthroughs we can make.
Have a sense of humor, like you mentioned, which I think is a great point. Sometimes you just have to kind of almost own it and own your mistakes, and I'm not necessarily saying laugh it off, but not go to a place where you feel shame of maybe past mistakes that you've done. Just say like, whoa, I've definitely learned, I've grown, and I can see things differently now. I have a different perspective.
Yeah, shame is the enemy of allyship, and it's something we need to keep in mind. Um, it is something that we can all easily feel if we're called out on something, but really, if we can treat it as learning experience. This is from a guy who finds this difficult too. I'm not saying that it's not, because certainly as I've engaged in some of these discussions more broadly in my own geographic community and my business community, I find myself saying things that and I'm trying to learn, but I'm trying to keep an open mind about it. Not always easy, but I think if we can't do that, then we're not going to be able to make much forward progress.
Well, I think you've really answered what does it mean to be an ally? Somebody that recognizes their privilege, recognizes that you're in a position of power and that you're different from other people, but can also kind of be introspective and really see where you can make any changes to better our industry. Because at the end of the day, in my perspective, it's that's what it's all about. I love our industry. My husband's a geotechnical engineer, and so am I. And we just want to see this industry thrive and be sustainable. I think that's a very key word: sustainability, making sure that we're attracting people. And I see our interns coming in all excited about college. And, sometimes I wonder, is this gonna last? Are we going to be able to retain these people? It is a difficult industry in its of itself. Like you said, professional industries, we work so many long hours. And not only that, we can't also put on top of it be having microaggressions, like you mentioned, having a hostile work environment that unfortunately kind of tying everything back together. A lot of the surveys from women leaving the industry, kind of going back to recruitment, not only say long working hours and maybe too much travel or not enough opportunities, but also, microaggressions. So being an ally also means to stand up to some of those microaggression and sometimes sweat the small stuff instead of not sweat the small stuff. Things that might, for you, might not be a big deal, but you can recognize that somebody else might feel uncomfortable and saying something. When you speak up as a leader, um, somebody else might feel more comfortable to speak up too. And that just creates a more inclusive culture. So that kind of really wraps things up. And we've been talking for almost an hour. So I want to put some closing thoughts. So just give us some recent experience in your involvement with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is there anyone that has inspired you? I mean, you mentioned racial justice. That sounds definitely like an inspiration to be more involved with DNI. But anyone in particular or any other thing that you might want to share with us?
Um, Something that when my wife actually began leading this racial justice initiative in our community, and it was something that she picked up at first reluctantly, only because of the time commitment that she foresaw. That turned out to be more than she could have imagined, and the determination and passion with which she pursued that, and my privilege of being able to sort of go along and act as a sounding board, night after night in meetings that we went to, I'll tell you, she's been a real inspiration for me, and truly, really began to open my eyes and get me on a path that was very different than anything I could have imagined before. Something I simply wasn't aware of, and I'm going to give her a lot of credit to getting me, first of all, interested and then passionate about issues around DEI and racial justice.
No, I think that's wonderful. Well, Charlie, I think that was a great conversation. I think you've really hit a lot of things in the head and really answered what it mean to be an ally and what we can do to um, evolve our industry and elevate our industry really. So I really thank you for joining us. And if you have anything else that you would like to add.
Veronica, I agree with you. I love our profession. I'm dedicated to our profession. I think it's a fantastic profession. And like you, I want to see it uh, be vital, and I want to see it sustain itself for the long term. So, and I believe all of the peers that I interact with and have over the years feel exactly the same way. And so that again gives me a lot of optimism for the future. There's just a lot of work to do, but hey, there always is, right? So thank you for providing this opportunity to talk to you today. I really Appreciate
Well,
it.
thank you so much for your commitment, and I really look forward to hopefully meeting you in the fall conference. Hopefully you can be there. If not, hopefully you can be there virtually. We will be presenting in the fall conference in a panel discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion with myself, Mike Hutchinson. He's the CEO of Geoengineers, and one of his consultants, Jamal Carney. So that's what's coming up next in our podcast. We're actually going to be recording that and releasing in our podcast. But thank you so much, Charlie. And I look forward to more conversations in the future.
Thank you, Veronica.
And that concludes this episode of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion podcast series, brought to you by the GBA podcast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the GBA podcast and leave us a review. And remember, improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in the geo profession is up to all of us. Thank you for listening.